Good morning, everybody. So I'll just jump right into it, I guess. My name is Dan Stanfield. I am a coach for C.K. McClatchy High School in high school, and I am also an assistant coach for the University of Iowa. A PhD student in communication studies. Most of the things that I write about, research about, are about rhetorics of eugenics, disability, some post-structuralist thought, but like mostly I focus on disability. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the sort of a history of disability-related activism, as well as sort of a brief history of disability studies as an academic discipline, what disability studies means for what we think about an idea of access as a concept, particularly in debate. And the third thing that we are going to talk about is disability arguments within the context of criminal justice reform, which we will be debating this year. Let me pull up a PowerPoint here. Okay. So here's my, since I'll be covering a lot of concepts, I've included my contact information. Please feel free to contact me at any time about any questions that you have related to this lecture. I'm more than happy to provide more context, provide more information. If you're looking for more resources, more things to research, I can definitely help you. I can definitely help out there, and I'm happy to do so. Okay, so let's jump right into it. So here's some brief things that you should be familiar with going into this lecture. The first one is ableism. So ableism, there are a variety of definitions that you might have heard or might not have heard before. There's one in particular that I like to go with, and that is ableism is defined as a system that places value on people's bodies and minds, and it's based on the societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. This is a form of systemic oppression that leads to people in society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's appearance and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. An important aspect of this is ableism is something that can happen to a variety of people. You do not have to be disabled in order to experience ableism. That is a misnomer that comes from sort of some earlier understandings of disability and ableism writ large. The second idea that I'd like to talk to you about is whether or not what language we should be using when we talk about disability. Meaning a lot of this debate gets described as whether you should use person-first language or identity-first language. Person-first language is when you're talking about disability, you would say that is a person with a disability, that is a person with autism, that is a person with deafness, that is a person with blindness, etc. And then identity-first language is, as you might expect, identity-first language is that says that is a disabled person, that is a autistic person, that is a blind person, that is a deaf person, etc. The most people writing and researching about disability now will use identity-first language. There are some individuals who choose to use person-first language, and there are some academics 10, 20 years ago who argued that we should be using person-first language. Some people will talk about how this is still a debate that is ongoing, so you can use whatever language you choose to. To an extent, that's true. However, predominantly both within like disabled individuals as well as people who write and research about disability overwhelmingly use identity-first language. The reason for that is pretty simple. Person-first language sort of implies implicitly that one cannot be that sort of one's humanity or personness sort of comes before their identity as a disabled individual, meaning that one that sort of disability sort of precludes one from being able to be sort of considered a person. Identity first language sort of recognizes that disability is an integral and important part of an individual's identity, but that and that it doesn't sort of preclude them from like being a person at all. The second or the third set of things that you should be familiar with is the idea of models of disability. And I'll be getting into this more in depth later in the lecture, but just to start off, medical model is sort of the default understanding of disability. It is the understanding of disability a lot of medical professionals will use. It was the understanding of disability that was used for hundreds of years. It is the idea that sort of disability is something that is caused by something that is wrong with you, something that is wrong with you, something that needs to be fixed, something that needs to be cured. Almost the entirety now of people writing about disability studies will be using a version of a social model of disability. The social model of disability says that it is not sort of medical conditions that cause an individual to be disabled, but it is instead a variety of social and societal structures that cause an individual to be disabled, i.e. someone who happens to use a wheelchair is not disabled by the fact that they happen to be using a wheelchair. They are disabled because buildings were designed without any ramps or elevators. It is sort of that lack of access, which is another important word that we're going to talk about later. Is that lack of access that makes them disabled, and not necessarily the sort of impairment or sort of like biological thing that makes them disabled. It is instead the way that thing, that i.e. the lack of being able to walk, that makes them disabled. It is entirely focused on the sort of the way that certain structures force someone to experience disability, and not the other way around. Okay, so like I already said, this lecture is going to cover a brief history of disability in the United States, as well as an overview of debates and history of disability studies as a discipline. I'll also talk about what access means, and finally, the connections between disability studies and criminal justice reform as the topic that you'll be debating this year. Okay, so let's get right into it. History of disability studies, history of disability in North America. So here's a quote. The institution, the asylum, the training school, the home, the mental hospital, the psychiatric facility, the farm colony, the developmental center, all of these are names given to facilities designed to house individuals that were categorized as deviant, defective, or delinquent throughout North American history. This is from Stephen Null's article, Institutions for People with Disabilities. This way of treating disability was largely prominent from like say 1750 to 1850. A lot of people believed that these institutions happened to be the best for society as well as the people in them. They weren't doesn't mean that these were natural. It just means that people truly believed that this was the best way to sort of treat disability. One of the primary justifications for this was Enlightenment, or the sort of Age of Reason as the justification. So in the Enlightenment, we no longer believed that sort of like God was the reason that people were disabled, but it was sort of something about the ways that individuals were born, but it was no longer sort of a type of sin or punishment. But this meant that human intervention could then fix disability if it wasn't just a type of curse that somebody was experiencing. There is a lot of things that we could talk about with institutionalization and asylums and mental hospitals. I'm gonna sort of skip a lot of this history just to the benefit of time. This could be an entire lecture in and of itself. So in the mid 20th century or so, these asylums started closing. some of this was due to policies in the state of California, as well as policies done by the federal government. However, a number of asylums and things like that started shutting down, and and a lot of literature that you will see if you happen to research this area of the topic, or you research things like decarceration, or you research things like abolition in relation to the topic, you will see that many people within these institutions and asylums sort of slowly started ending up in the prison system overall. That sort of the shutting down of institutions and asylums began a process of sort of shuffling individuals into the prison system. Sort of another important aspect of sort of the, I guess, history of disability in the United States that people should be familiar with is Buck versus Bell. So Buck versus Bell was a 1927 Supreme Court decision that made sterilization and basically eugenics a constitutionally protected right. Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough in his decision for the way he decided in Buck versus Bell. Some things that you should be familiar with this case, it still hasn't been overturned, actually. There are many sort of state level and federal level restrictions that make sterilization much harder and much more unlikely to happen. However, Buck versus Bell as a piece of legal doctrine is something that still exists, and it is something that is relevant to anyone who's interested in talking about the relationship sort of between disability and prison system and criminal justice, because sterilization can be still used as a sort of punishment for individuals. Sterilization can be and has been done within prison systems as recently as 10 years ago. So it is very much sort of a type of punishment and is a type of practice that still continues to this day. It's also pretty complicated in the sort of the types of things that Buck versus Bell gets used for, and the types of things that it's sort of bound up within. So what do I mean by this? So, for example, Buck versus Bell is part of the decision for Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court case that sort of legalized abortion, and the justification there was that abortion still shouldn't be a sort of limitless aspect. Another aspect of Buck v. Bell that is cited in Roe versus Wade is that abortion can and should be used in order to sort of protect individuals from being a drain on state resources or federal government resources, from being a drain on society by either using too much welfare, by using too much social services, by requiring too much free medical attention. And so that abortion can, at least according to the court, be used in order to prevent these individuals from ever existing, so that they won't become a sort of potential drain on state and federal government resources. Another sort of aspects of the history of disability that you should be at least cursory familiar with is, up until like the mid 20th century or so, there were things called ugly laws. Ugly laws were primarily used in like large cities like Chicago. But ugly laws said that it was an arrestable offense to basically be disabled and be in public. It was an arrestable offense for an individual to just be sort of walking about if they're sort of disfigured, if they had some kind of disability. The law wasn't clear about sort of like what constituted disability. It was kind of a you know it when you see it type thing. But there were a lot of individuals jailed, imprisoned, honestly executed because of the existence of these ugly laws. And the last one of these wasn't repealed in Chicago until I believe it was in either the 50s or the 60s. If you're interested in reading more about this, I find it kind of interesting. There's a book called Ugly Laws by Susan Schweik. And if you're interested in sort of like more of the sort of like general history of disability in the U.S., you should check out the book Kim Nielsen's A Disability History of the United States. Okay, next. So there was also a lot of activism related to disability within sort of the late 60s, early 70s, kind of jumping off of the successes of the civil rights movement. So this largely started with a group called the Rolling Quads in Berkeley. They started sort of agitated for more accessible spaces to exist in Berkeley. No one's really sure if it's an urban myth or not, urban legend or not, but supposedly a bunch of disabled activists in Berkeley in the 60s, in the middle of the night, went out and sort of used sledgehammers to create curb cuts into sidewalks. This has sort of been passed down by word of mouth. No, there's not necessarily evidence of this, but this was definitely something that happened. Just no one is really sure on the how exactly it came about. Interestingly enough, also the disability rights activists during this period of time, since this activism was largely going around in Berkeley, disability activists were very, very, very closely aligned actually with the Black Panther Party actually, and did a lot of organizing with the Black Panther Party, and a lot of the sort of activism that they did was sort of in conjunction with them. This is a piece of history that is not usually talked about as far as like disability activism or sort of the roots of disability activism. So I would try and remember that. Also, if you are interested in sort of reading more arguments about this, there's a wealth of sort of research that talks about the sort of the connections that early disability rights activists had with the Black Panther Party. And then, so this kind of culminated, or this activism sort of reached its height as far as this sort of civil rights era, near the beginning of the 90s, with the passage of the ADA. There was an event called the Capitol. There was a protest, sit-in, whatever you want to call it, in Washington D.C. called the Capitol Crawl, where a number of disability activists sort of in wheelchairs threw themselves off their wheelchairs and sort of crawled off the steps of the rotunda in Washington D.C. This event received a lot of attention and eventually became the sort of like catalyst for George H.W. Bush to sign the ADA into law. And the ADA was a huge win at the time. Now, since then, the ADA has been restricted. A lot of additions have been laid onto it. There are a lot of problems with the ADA, but at the time that it happened, it was a hugely successful piece of legislation, and it came about through types of activism. I think this is an important example that you could use if you're sort of interested in talking about disability in debate, or sort of interested in talking about sort of affirmatives or even negative arguments that are related to disability, about how this type of activism, sort of the telos of it, was in creating these types of like legal changes, as one example. So next, I will move into talking about disability studies. I promise all of this is relevant to talking about debate, relevant to talking about disability and debate. I am personally of the belief that sort of having an understanding of some of the history of disability, having an understanding of some of the things that are going on within disability studies or critical disability studies as academic disciplines will be useful for you in making arguments related to these. It'll help these arguments have more context. You'll be able to use more examples. You'll be able to make them more persuasively to a number of judges, rather than just sort of like rather than just me telling you how exactly you should make arguments related to disability in debate. Okay, so there are a number of central concerns in disability studies. So I've included on this slide here a number of sort of research words, or a number of Boolean search words that you could use when doing research related to the topic, in order and related to the topic and disability. You could use these as part of Boolean searches. You could use these as any sort of jumping off point for the research. I'll also show you a couple books that I think are going to be really useful for you on this topic towards the end of this lecture. But if you're looking to get a jump start now, like, these keywords will help you get a really good start. Okay. There are a few sort of major debates. There are a few major debates in disability studies. The first one is, what is your, like I mentioned earlier, what is your stance in relation to the social model, or related to the social model of disability? So the social model of disability sort of came about late 80s from a bunch of British social scientists, or British Marxists actually. It is the sort of a pure social model understanding. There's little to no discussion of sort of the role that individual bodies have. It is the purest form of the social model, which just says individuals are disabled as a result of social structures that disable them. It has nothing to do with the body. It has everything to do with how sort of social structures interact with bodies. Some major authors here are Oliver and Barnes. You can look them up if you're interested in reading more about this. This way of understanding disability sort of divided the social model and medical model as sort of distinct entities, and the social model sees disabled problems as arising entirely from social circumstances, and impairment as something that is necessarily neutral. One quote from the social model is, "Our own position on disability is quite clear and is fully in line with the agreed principles. In our view, it is society which disables physically impaired people. Disability is something imposed on top of our impairments. By the way, we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. Disabled people are therefore an oppressed group in society. It follows from this analysis that having low incomes, for example, is only one aspect of oppression. It is a consequence of our isolation and segregation in every area of life, such as education, work, mobility, housing, etc." This is a So this understanding of disability largely has its base in Marxism. There eventually actually became a fairly materialist backlash to this understanding of disability, because the biggest problem with it is it views impairment as something that's not entirely neutral and irreducible, and or it views impairment as something that is sort of like separate from disability, and so it moved away too far from sort of how we should understand what the body is and what the body does. So the backlash to this said that we should view impairment as not neutral at least in the same ways that this early understanding of disability did, and that we should sort of view impairment as sort of a type of condition that allows for certain social structures to be disabling in certain ways, so that we don't entirely move away from questions of the body. So we started here with this pendulum of the medical model, which there are a lot of problems with, and then we had this, and then we swung all the way to the other direction with the social model of disability, and in the middle ground, just like in debate, permutation largely ended up being better. We need to still understand some of the sort of like medicalized understandings of disability, but not the ways in which those medical understandings can be used to sort of do harm to disabled individuals. Instead, we should use those medicalized understandings, or those medical understandings, diagnoses, etc., in order to sort of understand the ways in which various other structures can be disabling in various ways. the silence on impairment, according to the individuals who had this backlash, made it difficult to deal with the difficult aspects of impairment. Many disabled people remain frustrated and disheartened by pain, fatigue, depression, chronic illness, including the way that those prevent us from realizing our potential or rallying fully against disability. Many of us fear for our futures with progressive or additional impairments. We mourn past activities that are no longer possible for us. We are afraid we may die early, or that suicide may seem the only option left. We desperately seek some effective medical intervention. We disabled people feel ambivalent about the possibilities of our children having impairments, and they are motivated to work for the prevention of impairments. Silence about impairment has made many of these things taboo and created a whole new series of constraints on our self-expression. This is a quote from Crow in the piece, including all our lives. This sort of move against the social model was in some degree based on feminism / feminist care ethics. Then there came even more understandings of disability in the early 2000s. This was kind of a post-structuralist negotiation of medical model and the social model, seeing impairment as both part of the individual bodily experience, and like I said, and also included in this are the ways that sort of social structures can be disabling in certain ways. So there are a few different sort of, I guess, approaches to dealing within disability studies. There are a variety of approaches that people use in order to, sorry, kind of lost my train of thought there. There are a variety of approaches that people use to sort of try and fix or solve the issues of ableism. There are sort of legal institutions within the disability rights model. This was the original model for activism. That's the one I talked about with like the rolling quads in the 60s and 70s, and the Capitol crawl in the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s. Sort of the ADA and sort of legal reforms like that were the goal of that sort of legal activism. It focuses on policy reforms and changes in government. For the most part, this activism tended to be sort of fairly dominated by sort of white, masculine, physically disabled individuals. This could very much be sort of an approach to policy or sort of middle of the road AFs on this topic. You could be very persuasive in doing so and talking about in sort of making policy changes that are aimed at sort of either reducing the number of disabled people imprisoned, reducing the sort of likely or what happens to disabled people when they are imprisoned. There are a number of sort of types of changes that you could make that focus on the sort of like policy side of disability studies and in relation to criminal justice. Then there is also sort of the cultural model of disability and disability justice. This is where most of my understanding of disability comes from, or at least most of the ways that I sort of think about disability are incredibly informed by principles of disability justice. So disability justice is a fairly recent development within the last decade or so. Disability justice was created by this group called Sins Invalid. They're a performance group in the United States, and they travel all over the United States as well as in areas outside the United States. They are sort of credited as being foundational to the creation of disability justice. Now, I've said the word disability justice a lot. What in the world am I talking about? So disability justice stresses disabled culture and community. It's about the solidarity of disabled people with other oppressed groups. There's a blogger who talks a lot about this and is one of the foundational people for disability justice, Mia Mingus. Most of her stuff isn't like academic in the traditional sense. So you can find it just by like sort of Googling her name, Mia-Mingus. You'll find lots of resources from her talking about disability justice and sort of what disability justice means. The group Sins Invalid has also created sort of 10 principles of what they mean by disability justice, and I'll go through them actually. So the first one is intersectionality. Intersectionality, simply put, says that that individuals are many things and they all impact us. We are not only disabled, we are also each coming from a specific experience of race, class, sexuality, age, religious background, geographical location, immigrant status, and more. Depending on context, there are areas where we experience privilege as well as areas of oppression. The term intersectionality was first introduced by feminist theorist Kimberly Crenshaw in '89 to describe the experiences of Black women who experience both racism and sexism in specific ways. And disability justice embraces Kimberly Crenshaw's understanding of intersectionality as a term. The second principle of disability justice is leadership of those that are most impacted. When we talk about ableism, racism, sexism, and transmisogyny, colonization, police violence, etc., we are not looking to academics and experts to tell us what's what. Disability justice says we lift up, listen to, read, follow, and highlight the perspective of those who are most impacted by the systems we fight against, i.e. the people who should be leading disability justice are the people that sort of like are impacted by things like racism, ableism, colonialism, sexism, misogyny, transmisogyny, etc. By centering, they say that by centering the leadership of those that are most impacted, it keeps themselves grounded in real world problems and find creative strategies for resistance. This is not to say that disability justice is incommensurate or sort of, incommensurate or mutually exclusive with sort of more academic approaches. It just means that sort of the individuals that should be leading disability justice say that it should be the individuals that are most impacted by it. Third principle of disability justice is an anti-capitalist politic. Capitalism depends on wealth accumulation for some at the expense of others and encourages competition as a means of survival. The nature of disability means that we resist conforming to normative levels of productivity in a capitalist culture, and labor is often invisible to a system that defines labor by able-bodied, white supremacist, gender normative standards. Fourth principle, and I'm sorry I'm moving so quickly here, there's a lot I was trying to get through. The fourth principle here is cross-movement solidarity. Disability justice can only grow into its potential as a movement by aligning itself with racial justice, reproductive justice, queer and trans liberation, prison abolition, environmental justice, anti-police terror, deaf activism, fat liberation, and other movements. This means challenging white disability communities around racism and challenging other movements to confront ableism. And as they say that through cross-movement solidarity, there's the ability to create a united front. Fifth principle is recognizing wholeness. Each person is full of history and life experience. Each person has an internal experience composed of our own thoughts, sensations, emotions, sexual fantasies, perceptions, and quirks. Disabled people are people in and of themselves. They aren't sort of incomplete people. They aren't sort of only partially whole people. They are whole people in and of themselves. Sixth principle, sustainability. Disabled people learn to pace themselves individually and collectively to be sustained in the long term. They value teachings of their bodies and experiences and use them as a critical guide and reference point to help move away from urgency into a deep, slow, transformative, unstoppable wave of justice and liberation. Seventh principle, commitment to cross-disability solidarity. A valuing of the honor and the insights and participation of all community members, even and especially those who are most often left out of these political conversations. It's about building a movement that breaks down isolation between people with physical impairments, people who are sick or chronically ill, psych survivors and people with mental health disabilities, neurodiverse people, people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, deaf people, blind people, people with environmental injuries and chemical sensitivities, and all others who experience ableism. Eighth principle, interdependence. Before the colonial project of Western European expansion, it was understood that the nature of interdependence within our communities. We see the liberation of all living systems in the land as integral to the liberation of our own communities as we all share one planet. We work to meet each other's needs as we build towards liberation without always reaching for state solutions, which inevitably extend state control further into our lives. Ninth principle is collective access. As Black and brown and queer individuals, we bring flexibility and creative nuance to our engagement with each other. We create and explore ways of doing things that go beyond able-bodied and neurotypical norms. Access needs aren't shameful. We all function differently depending on context and environment. Access needs can be articulated and met privately. We can share responsibility for our access needs. We can ask that our needs be met without compromising our integrity. We can balance autonomy while being in community. We can be unafraid of our vulnerabilities, knowing our strengths are respected. And the 10th and final principle is collective liberation, moving together as people with mixed abilities, multiracial, multigendered, mixed class, across a spectrum of sexualities, with a vision that leaves, or is supposed to leave, no individual behind. So I know that was a lot, but that's sort of brief overview of what I mean by disability justice. Okay, so continuing to move on here, the next thing I'd like to talk about is what I've used the word access quite a bit so far in talking about the things I've been talking about in this lecture. So what is access? So it's useful to think. So first, I'm not going to provide a one-size-fits-all definition for access, and I'll explain why I'm not necessarily doing that. So it's useful to think about access in relation to another concept, accommodation. So accommodation is, what happens in high schools, is what happens in colleges. It's what happens when you go to like various disability services offices to ask them for sort of resources to make, to get accommodations, to take tests, to get extra time for assignments, to make sure to get extra time moving between buildings if you're at a debate tournament, to get extra for anything that you need in order to sort of have the same educational experience as everybody else, which seems like a pretty good thing. And for the most part, it is. The issue with accommodation is accommodation becomes a very reactive way of thinking about disability. It can, accommodation is about responding to disability and not about sort of designing structures from the ground up in ways that are going to be, or at least try to be, accessible. If you have ever heard people talking about ideas like universal design is a principle that says that we should design, that when we are designing buildings, education, anything that has the ability to be designed should be designed with disability in mind, so that we can have accessibility from the forefront instead of accessibility only sort of coming afterwards, after somebody advocating for it. A statistic that has always been fairly frightening to me is that over 90%, disabled students on campuses spend over 90% of their time advocating for their own inclusion, meaning that they don't get to spend their time actually going to classes and learning things, but they spend their time advocating for their ability to get to do those things in the first place. And this exists in juxtaposition to access or accessibility. So the first thing that you should, if you're taking notes, that you should write down about accessibility is that accessibility is something that is generative. What do I mean by generative? Generative means that access is an opportunity. It is not a limitation. So frequently when people think about what access is or what access is not, they think about access in terms of the things they can't do. I think that's kind of a bad framework for thinking about what accessibility is. Accessibility is an opportunity to sort of create new ways of engaging, new ways of learning, new ways of participating in various spaces in order to ensure that everyone can sort of participate in that space in the ways that they would most want to participate in that space. This is very relevant both in debate, because there are a variety of sort of accessibility concerns that can come up in debate, and especially moving into the world of online debate. While it seems that like online debate should be more accessible to a number of individuals, online debate also sort of raises issues, because what does it mean for individuals who can't necessarily hear? How do we sort of make sure that they can participate in the same ways? What is it, and how do we sort of make online debate accessible for those who can't see? How do we make it for those who are sort of overwhelmed with, because of various like mental or cognitive impairments, with the sort of info overload that happens in a world of online debating? These are all sort of types of concerns that could potentially come up when we are thinking about accessibility concerns. So the second thing that I want you to understand about access or accessibility is that access is an encounter and it's a relationship. So it's not about like we have done one thing and that means that we have made this space accessible. Access is about sort of a continual negotiation, because and if you have ever been someone who needs like sort of has access needs at a debate tournament, sometime where, for example, you might require like a static room to debate in. Well, sometimes individuals who need a static room will debate other individuals who need a static room. And so the tournament frequently will just like flip a coin to decide who has to move. Sometimes they'll like ask individuals who would be better able to move. The point here is that access needs to be a continual negotiation between all parties involved. It is not something that sort of it's a one and done or a quick fix solution. If there are multiple individuals who require access in various ways, there needs to be a negotiation about what access means in the context of those two individuals being together. Whereas access, if it was just one of them, is one thing, and access that was just another person, it was an entirely different thing. Access can't and shouldn't sort of be sort of fully prescribed from the jump. Access needs to be a negotiation. There needs to be a conversation about what access is and the types of access needs that various individuals have. Okay. So, and what does that have to do with debate? Well, first of all, I'm personally of the belief that we should try and make debate as accessible as possible. And so if you think about access in this way, like maybe it'll help you maybe be less frustrated when there are sort of access issues that happen in a tournament, or you have a better understanding of the types of ways that you should behave, or behave is a bad word, the types of ways that you should react when there are access needs that individuals have. Again, you should look at access as sort of a space for encounter, as a space to sort of like build new ways of understanding, build new ways of thinking about debate. An accessible debate does not have to mean that debate is sort of more limited, not restricted, etc. Yeah, okay. So that's sort of what access is. So finally, let's talk about disability in relation to the topic. So there are, and I know that I'm running short on time here. Like I said, I think it's more important that you have an understanding of what's going on with disability studies, what is going on with sort of the history of disability, in order to sort of in order to have a better engagement when making or responding to disability arguments in debate. So the first thing that I will say, there's a misconception that if you're making argument about disability or you're making argument about ableism, that's just like sort of rhetoric arguments. It's just arguments about language or improper language use. That's very much not the case. While sort of the types of language that individuals use in relation to disability and the types of language that people use in general are important topics of conversation, disability is so much more than that. We are debating about criminal justice reform for the next year. Criminal justice reform has a lot of connections with disability. Like I alluded to when talking about the history earlier, when the process of deinstitutionalization happened, when we started closing asylums, more people started ending up in prisons. That is something that sort of a topic of criminal justice reform could look at, and as well as the sort of types of treatment that people with various levels of mental disabilities experience within the criminal justice system. What is it? Even just the sort of like history of the idea to sort of like plead insanity when it comes to sort of like legal cases. What does that mean? How is it that anyone can necessarily plead this? What does it mean that that the legal system's response to that sort of plea is to put them in a space of like cure, that disability then becomes blamed for the sort of violence or whatever sort of ill will or ill deeds that individual's done, has become sort of scripted as part of the types of disability that they had. There's a lot of areas that you can talk about disability on this topic. Now, if you're interested in like reading disability as a negative argument as a critique, so disability as a critique differs a lot from, maybe critiques like the CAP-K, anti-Blackness, feminism, etc. A lot of other criticisms are about sort of describing a structural way that the world operates. Like capitalism says the world operates according to economic conditions. Anti-Blackness says the world is organized by the Middle Passage as a metaphysical event horizon. Feminism says the world is sort of structured, or like various feminism critiques say that the world is sort of organized by sort of like by patriarchal impulses. While disability criticism definitely says that ableism is something that sort of like helps structure the world, disability isn't, this is not a sort of structural criticism. It is not sort of describing a way the world operates. Instead, disability criticisms very much sort of complicate existing ways of understanding the world. Like, for example, you can integrate capitalist disability understandings with sort of anti-capitalist critiques. Like, what does it mean to sort of have resistance to capital, and what does it mean to have resistance to capital for a disabled individual? What do I mean by that? There's a quote I like by this individual, Joanna Havda. She says, how can you throw a brick through the window of a bank if you can't get out of bed in the morning? What does it mean to engage in these types of resistant strategies that like some critical apps might be doing if there are various sort of access needs or access conditions that sort of prevent you from being able to sort of like resist in the same ways, protest in the same ways, march in the same ways? That disability becomes sort of a complicating factor here. If we look at the sort of discussions of gender, discussions of feminism, disability is about complicating the relationship there. It is not saying that feminism is wrong. It's saying that there are additional nuances that we need to be considered. In this way, I have found that disability criticisms to be very strategic in sort of debating other critical affirmatives. There are frequently ways that you can sort of like poke holes and generate offense against critical affirmatives that are based on that sort of about sort of omitting disability in various ways, or about the ways that they understand disability in a particularly violent way. Or, for example, on this topic, one of the biggest asks is both critical and policy are going to be talking about decarceration, about ways that that certain types of criminal justice reform lead to sort of broader types of resistance against the criminal justice system, against the prison industrial complex. There are arguments to be made that sort of if we focus entirely on the prison system and we don't think about places like where disabled people get sort of locked up, or the ways in which disabled people are treated within the prison system or within the legal system sort of writ large, that we just sort of shift what happens within imprisonment. We don't actually do anything about the prison industrial complex if we don't sort of start with the perspective of thinking about disability. These are arguments that can be made against the sort of variety of abolition asks and sort of decarceration asks that you will see throughout the year, both the sort of more policy leaning ones as well as the more critical leaning ones. I think disability becomes a useful way of sort of approaching the topic here. Disability criticism, or disability arguments about disability and debate are also really useful when there are various like sort of legal issues being discussed. There's a lot of both critical disability studies, that's usually abbreviated CDS, and even disability studies literature that talks about the ways in which the sort of like legal systems are sort of fail disabled individuals. For example, while this isn't 100% relevant to this topic, the 99.9% of of suits that individuals file under the ADA end up being dismissed because legal systems say, well, that discrimination wasn't because you have a disability, or the thing that you are saying a disability doesn't meet the ADA's legal definition of what a disability is. So if you could read enough, you could have like you could have policy affirmatives, which talk about the different approach that talk about sort of defining disability in more expansive ways in order to allow for sort of individuals to have better recourse within the legal system, or to have or for the justice system to be more fair to disabled individuals. You could have more critical affirmatives that talk about the sort of like the failures of the ability, the failures of like the legal system to do anything at all in regards to disability. One of the examples there that could be used is like Buck versus Bell, that Supreme Court case that I mentioned earlier in this lecture, is still a law that is on the books. It is still something that has not been overturned. It is still very much something that exists and is going on and is still going on in the world. That's sort of like a brief sort of explanation of the types of arguments related to disability that you can make. If you are looking specifically for more research in relation to into arguments about disability justice in relation to like abolition, there are a few places that I would suggest you look. There is an author, I think, who is very prolific on the subject, Liat Ben Moshe, LIATBEN-MOSHE. That if you go and look them up, you'll they have a book that came out at the end of May 2020, as well as a book that came out in 2015 that is very in depth on disability and the prison system in the Persian industrial complex. I think there are a variety of sort of ways that you could explore that literature base using that author's books. I've already talked about Mia Mingus. You can look up her work. Some of the like principles of disability justice that I showed you. This book is particularly useful. It's called Skin, Tooth, and Bone: The Basis of Our Movement is Our People, a Disability Justice Primer. Kind of hard to find online. However, it's pretty easy to find either an e-copy from their website, from Sins and Valids website. You could another really helpful book is this book, Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice. And so those are the last two books that I showed you are sort of more useful for sorry, I lost my train of thought there, are more useful for sort of having a better understanding of what disability justice is if you're interested in making arguments exclusively about disability justice. Those will dovetail and work very well with the Liat Ben Moshe books and research that I told you about already. That's pretty much what I got. Again, if you have any questions or want to know more information about anything that I've already talked about, feel free to email me any questions that you might have. Thank you for taking the time and listening to me today.